Thanks very much for coming, everyone. You comfortable?
Yeah.
Good. So Markus is, as you know, the CEO and founder of Taxify. Let's call you Europe's answer to Travis Kalanick, but without a lot of the unpleasantries. I mean, I think a lot of people here will know Taxify, but just for anyone who doesn't, I mean, maybe it's good to start with a quick overview of what the company is, when you founded it, what cities you're in, and what kind of modes of transport are you looking at the moment?
Sure. So, hello everyone. Taxify is the largest European ride-sharing company, now operating in 25 countries around the world. Vast majority of our trips happen in Europe, but we're also the biggest operator in Africa. So we're focusing on these two geographies.
Where are you in Africa?
We're in all the bigger economies, so Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, expanding to more actually every quarter. And overall, we've been really focused on the private driver market so far. But now recently, a couple of months ago, we started with scooter sharing as well, with the first market being France, and now expanding to the other countries we're in.
Great. And which is your biggest market? Is that Paris?
So in Europe, it's France, Poland, Romania, and in Africa, it's Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa.
And you're yet to go into London and a few other big cities. Presumably that's at some point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what a lot of people might not realize is that actually in Central Eastern Europe, we're already the biggest operator. So we're even in most of the countries way ahead of our American friends. But in Western Europe, we're just getting started.
So I think if you speak to the normal person on the street, the impression about the European or almost the Western ride-sharing market might be that isn't that a monopoly? I think is almost synonymous with Uber. So I mean, it's obviously not a monopoly because you guys are in a lot of cities and you have pretty decent market share. But do you expect that to be the case long term? Because there is a theory that actually the economics of this industry is that the network effects are so powerful that whoever has the most liquid platform will, it will snowball at that point. I mean, how do you think about that question?
So overall, how we see it is that actually it was very right to say that Western Europe in ride-hailing was a monopoly, and in many ways it still is. For example, in the UK, essentially, I mean, Uber has more than 80% market share, and there's really no big competitors yet. But how we see it is that actually there is room for a duopoly in the long term. And why that is because adding more drivers has a very diminishing effect on the overall customer experience. So if you have 1,000 drivers in a city or you have 10,000, the service doesn't get 10 times better. It might get a tiny bit better, but it's not enough to justify taking outrageous fees. So what we're showing is that actually it's not that hard to come in as a second player and actually win over time.
Okay, that's interesting. And I mean, the other kind of general question I think people have for anyone who's taking on Uber is the fact that they are backed by this enormous capital cannon, I think the Uber CEO calls it. And SoftBank with its enormous resources is essentially what you're up against. I mean, I take your point that there are diminishing returns to getting drivers on the platform. But the phrase that the Uber CEO uses is, I'd rather have their capital cannon behind me than pointed at me. I mean, you've got it pointed at you. I mean, is that not a kind of existential threat for you?
Sure. So what's really insane in many ways is that the first 3 years of the company, we had only raised $3 million overall. And we still managed to compete and grow to 15 countries. So now that we have raised close to 200 million over the past few years, when we actually put it in perspective, then compared to the cities and ride-hailing, that we are investing versus Uber, the sums aren't that different. So then it more comes down to who has the better operations, who has the better tech exactly for those markets. And being honest, us being focused on less countries and only ride-hailing is why we're successful.
Got it. So it's not a market where it's essentially, who has the biggest checkbook. There's more nuance than that. I mean, very few markets are like that. I mean, the other kind of, not to spend too long just to compare you to Uber, but the other difference that people often talk about is that Uber is known, at least in Europe, at least under the previous CEO, for having a very aggressive attitude towards dealing with regulators. Now, you quite explicitly market yourselves as different to that. I mean, could you provide some specific examples of how that actually works in practice? What do you not do that they would do, or what do you do that they would not do?
So that's one of the hardest things for us. So being a startup, we would be so happy to launch new cities, new products every couple of weeks. But we have to be realistic. Like, this is Europe. This is not how cities actually want to be behaved. So what we need to do is from the start, actually work together with cities. So that means we typically roll out a bit slower. Whether we look at ride-hailing or the scooter sharing business, we actually wait to get approval from cities, work together with them, instead of rolling out and then shutting down. And there's a number of examples now in Europe from countries where we operate, and there's nobody else essentially there, because the other ride-hailing companies didn't want to comply. So that continues to be one of the big advantages for us, being a European player.
So presumably the bet there is that you're growing a little bit slower than you could do if you were taking the more aggressive approach, but you think that it's more prudent in the long term to, not suddenly have a regulator and turn around and say, hey, look, this is not a good relationship, what are we going to do about it?
Exactly. So we think it's a bit better to not be aggressive and operate for 6 months, but rather take things a bit more slowly and then operate for 10 years.
Got it. Okay. So you mentioned this at the beginning, but I think most people use ride-hailing platforms essentially as a taxi app at the moment. But there is a lot of talk and slightly less action than talk on bringing other modes of transport into these apps. I mean, you guys have got scooters in Paris now, is that right? Is that the only other mode of transport you're offering at the moment? And how do you think about that question of, these won't just be taxi apps in 10 years, presumably?
Sure. So overall, when we look at our user base now, we have about 15 million customers who use us.
15 million?
15 million. So it's already quite a sizable amount. I mean, not many European tech companies even operate at the scale. And they're really engaged. So what we can do is start to offer them more and more services. So they would use a higher share of their weekly trips with us. The first one being for short rides, which is really economical, is the scooters. But on top of that, we're now looking at doing, for example, car rentals for the really long distance trips where ride sharing is just too expensive. And looking at a few other vehicle types to bring on board in 2019.
Okay. What about the more kind of wacky future style stuff? I mean, is there anything else that we should be looking out for? Or is it just scooters and car rentals for now?
So we really need to look at every market specifically.
Yeah.
So in Africa, for example, we're really investing in motorcycle taxis.
Okay,
so that's a massive industry that's currently offline and is going to be digitalized in the next couple of years. So we really need to look at it market by market.
What about public transport? Is the other kind of big area of integration here? I mean, are you planning to, what would be the relationship between ride-hailing apps and scooter apps, whatever, and public transport? There is one vision of the market where essentially the interface will just integrate all of this, and some people are doing this already. I mean, how do you approach that?
So I think what's just not reported at all is actually how small a part is ride-sharing in the overall scheme of things. So all the ride-hailing apps together in every city typically make up 2% of all urban traffic.
2%?
So it's close to nothing. I mean, after all 7 years of buzz and like billions being thrown into it, it's just a couple of digits of percentage of traffic. So that's why all the platforms now are looking at how can we increase that? How do we build more products that actually get us to a meaningful amount of urban traffic? So when people ask us like, okay, you're going to add public transportation, aren't you afraid you're going to lose some trips? I mean, we're currently just on 2%. Like if we add public transportation, we actually have room to grow 20x from where we are today. So all the platforms have a big incentive to get it done. And overall, I see we're really well positioned to actually start integrating public transport and doing these combined trips. So you might start off with a scooter, use a subway for the next stop, and so on.
Okay, but how do the economics work for a company like yours? If I think about the marginal incentive for you, you get revenue if they use a taxi. You get slightly less revenue if they use a scooter. You get effectively no revenue if they jump on a bus. I mean, how advantageous is it for you to actually recommend the quickest route if you have your interest is not necessarily aligned with the consumer? Do you see what I mean?
Sure. So that again comes back to this 2%. So if we were strictly looking at the audience we have, then of course it would look like we're cannibalizing ourselves and then sending traffic to our revenues, like a source where we don't make any revenue. But then again, when you think about the other 98% of trips that are currently not on the platform, then what we see will happen is that we bring that on board, and then gradually those people will actually discover that on a lot of trips it makes sense to use ride-sharing instead. So actually we see it as a long-term growth avenue for us.
Okay, and so it's about kind of keeping control of that consumer relationship as well, and that's worth some kind of cannibalization.
Exactly. So at the end of the day, it's more like how do we create the most value for users, and then once they're already on the platform, then they oftentimes will just opt in for a service where we actually make revenue as well.
Got it. So when we're talking about public transport, I mean, the title of this talk is Europe's Grand Mobility Plans. There's a sort of, civic mindedness implied in that. I mean, what needs to happen for these kind of visions of a, highly optimized kind of data savvy, public transport app to happen from a kind of regulatory point of view? I mean, is it easy to integrate this stuff at the moment, or does it depend on the market?
Well, as usual with Europe, it depends on the market. So
that's a fair point.
We have a number of cities which have approached us, like Tallinn and Helsinki, which have all their public transportation data is fully available real time. So you can get the GPS coordinates of every bus or whatever other vehicle on the road. So all of that is actually there. It's just a matter of building it out and then integrating it together with our ride-sharing and Squirrel services. But of course, there's a number of countries which don't give out this data or give it out on exclusive basis, which we think is actually the worst thing, because it should be public data and you should allow competition and the best platform to emerge organically.
Can you give any examples, or are those discussions confidential? I mean, who's good on this and who's bad on this?
I'm not going to bash any European cities.
Okay, cool. We'll have to do some reporting on that then. I mean, so the data question seems quite important here. Is it just a matter of how public is this data and who owns the data? And presumably your app is going to be generating a lot of data, which if then was fed back into the wider system, that would be quite useful from a city's point of view. I mean, how do you think about that question? Would you let other players use your data? Would you let the city, the public authorities use your data?
Well, being honest, and actually who owns right now most of the data is just Google Maps. So I mean, they have hundreds of millions of users who already use it for public transportation, and they don't share that at all. Yeah. So we actually don't see that being a big necessity for new platforms to emerge. So what we just need is access to public transportation data that the cities have, and then start to build interfaces on top of that. So right. we don't really see there's a big barrier to entry at the moment.
Okay, so basically we're back to this familiar problem of one of the big tech platforms, in this case Google, having a kind of competitive moat around data, and it's not really clear. Do you think, I mean, if you speak to some municipal authorities in Europe, there is a kind of whispering policy movement that you would actually force a lot of these companies to try and hand that over? That would presumably be a kind of inflection point for you guys and for the rest of the industry. You would then be able to seize on that, and you could do all kinds of exciting things that you're not doing now.
Sure. So when we look at the most European countries, I mean, there's so many fights essentially going on in parallel. First of all, being about access to this public transportation data, whether that's going to be public for everyone. What's going on with scooter sharing is another open topic now. And even ride-hailing, after 7 years, is still not allowed in many European countries. So there's still so many different things going on in parallel for us to actually achieve this vision of combining all of it together.
Okay. There's another, I saw a question come through a minute ago that do keep sending questions through, that I was intrigued by, what is the role of subsidies? I think that's something that people talk about a lot. You'll hear casually people say, oh, Uber's unproven because they give so many subsidies and no one really knows what the market is going to look like when it's mature. Could you explain where subsidies play a role, driver subsidies and consumer subsidies, and how you approach that? And is it different in each city? Like, what's the policy?
Sure. So fundamentally, ride-hailing is a marketplace. So you have drivers, you have riders. The more you have of either side, the better the service gets for both. So if you have higher concentration of drivers, you have faster arrival times, and then again, if you have more customers, drivers make more money per hour. So definitely there's a strong network effect there. And if we see there's an incumbent who's essentially a monopoly and controls all the supply, then we need to have some kind of advantage why people would even bother to use us in the first place. So that's why all these companies are raising billions of dollars to essentially get to this critical mass in every single city. that we've now also done in vast majority of countries in Europe and Africa.
So the majority of subsidy activity goes on when you're in ramp-up phase in a new city, and it's essentially just to get critical mass on the platform so that you have sufficient liquidity for the app to actually be usable. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
So that's the phase where you definitely need investments, regardless of what your competition is doing. But in the late stage, of course, it depends on what's going on in the marketplace. When we right now look at Southeast Asia, you have many established players, essentially, and they're still investing heavily and burning money every month. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the competitive landscape.
Got it. And let's bring another buzzword up. What about autonomous cars? I mean, how do you, this is obviously something that Uber has looked at from a few different angles in terms of partnership, in terms of in-house development. It's sort of is an interesting area. Do you have any kind of active theory on autonomous cars and how that is going to be an opportunity versus a challenge for you? Presumably, it's just we're going to take a bunch of cost out because we don't have to pay drivers.
Sure. So I mean, overall, how I think about it is that autonomous cars are seriously overhyped in the short term, and electric
seriously overhyped in the short term.
Overhyped, yeah. And electric vehicles, small ones like scooters, are still somewhat like underappreciated.
Okay.
So when we look at the next 5 years, it's very clear. Scooters is something where the tech is ready. You can just start to deploy them by tens of thousands in every city. They are usually more affordable than using anything else, and it makes a lot of sense. But autonomous cars is going to take years and years before they actually get to all the cities.
Yeah.
So we're not betting on that in the short term.
You're not. So this is not some kind of. It's not really an active discussion internally at the moment, thinking how we're going to. It's so far out that it's not relevant for you in terms of business plans at the moment.
So in the long term, obviously, as we're the biggest European ride-hailing platform, we will be having autonomous cars on the platform as well. But that's not going to be anything meaningful to consumers in the next 5 years.
Got it. And I think we've got not very much time before we wrap up, but one of your biggest investors is a traditional car maker, Daimler. They invested in the most recent round. I think they led the most recent round. Yep. They're valued at you at $1 billion, which is very impressive. Congratulations. What does that partnership between, that company is like 100 years old or so. What does that say about your future? I mean, what kind of partnership with the traditional guys do you envisage in the future?
So I think what it shows as well that as we already have Daimler on board, one of the leading car makers in the world, we have Didi as a big investor, the biggest ride-hailing company in the world, is that we're very open to find strategic partners who share our views. In a sense that we believe that the local operator is best equipped to build a local product, because transportation is a very local problem. So as long as we find strategic partners who share that view, that they see that Europe requires a different sort of approach, then we're happy to have them on board.
Great. Thank you very much, Markus. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Markus, a round of applause. Cheers.